The city breathed a heavy air that autumn, grayer and damper than usual. It wasn't just the weather. A palpable tension, a collective murmur of apprehension, seemed to seep through window cracks and leak from telephones. Liam felt it in the office of the Daily Clarion, a low hum beneath the constant typing and hurried calls. Initially, there were just strange rumors, the kind that flare up and die on social media, isolated panic attacks, too intense to be normal. But the stories persisted, gaining a disturbing consistency. Ordinary people with no history of anxiety, suddenly paralyzed by acute, specific phobias, an overwhelming fear of birds, a crippling claustrophobia in open spaces, an inexplicable dread of their own shadow. Liam, flipping through the online news with the usual skepticism of someone who'd seen all kinds of passing hysterias, mentally filed the incidents under strange, but probably explainable. Collective stress, perhaps, or a new synthetic drug on the streets. Still, the frequency and bizarre nature of the cases scratched at the surface of his journalistic curiosity. Driving home late that afternoon, observing the tense faces of pedestrians hurrying under the fine drizzle, he noticed a new storefront in the historic district, squeezed between a dusty bookstore and a trendy cafe. Curiosities Chills, read the sign in elegant, somber letters above a dark wooden door. An antique shop. It seemed to have appeared overnight, yet carried an air of ancient permanence and a silent, slightly sinister invitation in its impeccably arranged but perpetually dim window display. He didn't pay much attention. The city was full of new shops trying to ride the wave of downtown revitalization. Little did he know that the name, almost ironic, would soon echo in his mind. The whispers turned into discreet headlines in the following days. An article in the Clarion itself mentioned the unexplained wave of anxiety, quoting perplexed doctors and theories about environmental contamination. Liam read, scratched his head, but still didn't see a solid investigative lead until Wednesday morning. The call came from Sarah, a freelance photographer he'd occasionally worked with. Her voice was choked, hesitant. Liam, it's about David Miller, the city archivist, remember? Liam remembered. David was a methodical man, almost robotic in his organization, known for his calmness and for spending hours in dusty archives without complaint. He hasn't left his house in 2 days, Sarah continued. His sister called me. He's having terrible panic attacks. Apparently he developed agoraphobia, severe. He can't even get near the window. Agoraphobia, the fear of open spaces. For a man like David, it was a sentence. But why? Did something happen? Liam asked, his skepticism starting to yield to a pang of genuine concern. His sister said it started suddenly on Sunday. He just keeps repeating something about the sky being too open, the crushing emptiness. But the strangest thing, Liam, he had just come back from a walk downtown, said he bought himself a little gift, something to decorate his office desk. Sarah paused. An old paperweight, a slightly dented brass globe. He bought it at a new shop, an antique store. I think it's called Curiosities Chills. The name snapped in Liam's mind, cold and sudden like the drizzle outside. The shop he'd seen days before. A coincidence? Maybe, but the connection was too direct to ignore. David Miller, the methodical archivist, paralyzed by agoraphobia after buying an object from that specific store. The story, previously diffuse, had gained a face and a location. Liam thanked Sarah, hung up, and looked out the office window. The decision was made. It wasn't just about isolated cases of panic anymore. It was about that shadowy shop in the historic district. He needed to take a closer look. That afternoon, he passed by Curiosities Chills again. The door was closed, but a faint light shone inside. An elderly man hurried out, his face pale, clutching a small package to his chest. He didn't look sideways before disappearing into the crowd. The next day, Liam took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy wooden door of Curiosities Chills. A discreet bell announced his entry, but the sound seemed immediately absorbed by the place's almost unnatural quietude. The interior was larger than it appeared from the outside. a labyrinth of tall shelves filled with fascinating and slightly disturbing objects. Porcelain dolls with overly fixed eyes, sinister-looking medical instruments, leather-bound books with no titles, silent music, boxes. There was a peculiar smell in the air, a mix of old dust-polished wood and something else, something Swedish and vaguely metallic, like the scent before a storm or the tang of blood in the mouth. Despite the profusion of items, everything was impeccably arranged, each object positioned as if part of a meticulous exhibition. The lighting was low, coming from strategically placed lamps that created long, dancing shadows. From the back of the shop emerged a tall, slender man, dressed in an impeccable gray suit that seemed a bit too formal for a simple antiquarian. He must have been in his late 60s, with gray hair combed back and a face marked by fine lines that could belong to wisdom or cruelty. His eyes, however, were what commanded the most attention, clear, almost transparent, and with an intensity that seemed to peer beyond the surface. "May I help you?" he asked, his voice smooth and cultured, with a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Liam Kelly from the Daily Clarion." He introduced himself, extending his hand. The man, who introduced himself as Elias Thorne, the proprietor, shook it briefly. His touch was dry and cold. "I'm doing a story on the recent anxiety incidents in the city. I noticed your shop is new and has attracted quite a bit of attention. Some of those affected mentioned buying items here recently." Thorne arched an eyebrow delicately. "Ah, the panic attacks, as the press likes to call them." He gestured around. "My clients seek the unique, the evocative. Sometimes objects with history carry resonances. Strong emotions can be contagious, don't you think, Mr. Kelly? Perhaps modern sensibilities are a bit atrophied." He spoke calmly, choosing his words carefully. Liam tried to press him about David Miller, about the brass globe, but Thorne skillfully deflected, talking about the subjective nature of art, the psychology of collecting, how old objects can awaken forgotten memories or fears. It was a verbal dance, and Thorne was a master. Liam left the shop feeling more confused than before. There was nothing concrete to hold on to, no proof, just a growing sense that Elias Thorne knew much more than he let on, and that the oppressive atmosphere of the shop wasn't just dust and shadows. Skepticism still fought back, but a seed of genuine apprehension had been planted. The conversation with Thorne, though inconclusive, ignited a flame in Liam's investigative stubbornness. He spent the next few days immersed in digital archives and social media reports, searching for any mention of the panic attacks that might have escaped official news. The pattern became undeniable, almost glaring when viewed collectively. A young art student bought an old hand mirror at Curiosities Chills, and 2 days later, developed isoptrophobia, a morbid fear of her own. Reflection, refusing to look at any polished surface. A stockbroker, known for his aggressiveness and love of crowds, acquired an ornate pocket watch and now suffered from demophobia, so severe he couldn't leave his apartment for fear of encountering other people. Purchase at Thorne's shop. Sudden onset of a specific debilitating phobia. Isolation. It was a sinister, repetitive sequence. As he compiled the information, Liam began to feel something strange. An old vertigo, which he vaguely associated with a bad fall in childhood, started manifesting at unexpected moments. Looking out the third-floor window of the newspaper office caused sudden nausea and the sensation that the floor was tilting. Once, in the crowded elevator, he felt an oppressive shortness of breath, the walls seeming to close in on him, a claustrophobia that had never bothered him before. He attributed it to stress, to sleepless nights spent poring over the bizarre cases, but a part of him, the part that now accepted the strangeness of Thorne's shop, wondered if it wasn't something more, if the mere proximity to that source of fear wasn't somehow stirring his own dormant ghosts. Confirmation that he hadn't gone unnoticed came subtly, yet chillingly. One evening, arriving home, he found a small unmarked package on his doorstep. Inside, wrapped in black velvet, was a heavy antique metal keychain depicting a bird with outstretched wings. Nothing explicitly threatening, but Liam felt a shiver run down his spine. He vaguely recalled mentioning during the conversation with Thorne a distant incident with a nest of aggressive crows when he was a child. Had it been a test? A silent message that Thorne saw him, heard him, and perhaps even knew his most buried fears? That small metal object felt like it weighed a ton in his hand, a tangible reminder that his investigation had put him on the radar of something ancient, patient, and terrifyingly dangerous. Fear was no longer just a news story, it was beginning to seep into his own life. Armed with the disturbing pattern and the personal experience of the sinister keychain, Liam felt he had enough to, at the very least, raise an official red flag. He scheduled a meeting with Detective Miller, no relation to David, the archivist, a veteran cop with whom he had collaborated before. The reaction was predictable and disheartening. Miller listened patiently, leafed through Liam's notes on the victims and the shop purchases, but his eyes betrayed his skepticism. "Liam, I understand your concern, but sudden phobias linked to an antique shop? There's nothing here that constitutes a crime. Stress, mass suggestion, maybe even something in the dust of these old objects causing bizarre allergic reactions. But blaming the shop owner for stealing fears?" Miller shook his head, offering coffee and advice to take a few days off. Frustrated, Liam tried approaching the victims' families again. The responses were even more desolate. Some hung up on him, exhausted and protective of their ailing loved ones. Others confirmed the victims were heavily medicated, hospitalized, or simply locked away in their private worlds of terror, unable to articulate anything coherent about the origin of their affliction. David Miller's sister said he could barely form sentences, just stare blankly at the ceiling. It was like hitting invisible walls. Every door closed, every lead led to a human or bureaucratic dead end. The isolation began to weigh on him. At the newspaper, colleagues looked at him with a mixture of pity and impatience, as if he were obsessed with a crazy conspiracy theory. His own conviction wavered under the weight of others' disbelief. One afternoon, getting out of the elevator, at the office now a daily ordeal, he stumbled on the small uneven step in the hallway. For an instant of pure panic, the floor seemed to drop away vertiginously, the ceiling descending to crush him. He gasped, grabbing the wall, his heart pounding. It lasted only a second, but left him trembling and clammy. Was it just a clumsy stumble, accumulated stress? Or was it Thorne somehow, pulling strings in his mind from afar? Doubt was a slow poison. He realized then that conventional methods, police, interviews, logic, were useless against an adversary operating in the shadows of the human mind itself. He was alone in this, and the next move would have to be outside the rules. Frustration and growing fear coagulated into a dangerous resolve in Liam's mind. If the outside world couldn't see the truth, he would have to wrench it from the bowels of the shop itself. He waited until the early hours of Saturday morning, when the streets of the historic district were deserted and darkness was his only ally. Dressed in dark clothes, his heart hammering against his ribs, he circled the block, studying the silent facade of Curiosities Chills. The front door was sturdy, but a narrow high-side window looked less secure, leading to the back of the establishment. With simple tools and trembling hands, he cursed for their lack of steadiness. He managed to force the old lock after minutes that felt like hours. The soft click of the window yielding sounded like a gunshot in the night silence. Sliding inside, he found himself in a dusty, cluttered hallway, different from the calculated elegance of the main area. Stacked boxes, furniture covered in ghostly white sheets, the smell of mold mixed with that peculiar Swedish, metallic odor, now stronger. Guided by intuition and a faint line of light coming from under a door at the end of the hall, he moved forward on tiptoe. The door creaked in protest as he opened it, revealing a narrow staircase descending into what looked like a basement. The air grew colder as he descended. What he found below made him stop, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't an ordinary storage cellar. The rough stone walls were lined with dark wooden shelves reaching from floor to ceiling, and upon them, in neat, endless rows, were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of glass jars. Each jar contained a luminous, swirling mist, pulsing with vibrant sickly colors, electric blues, nauseating greens, angry reds, feverish yellows. It was mesmerizing and deeply repulsive. Liam approached a shelf, fascinated and horrified. Small handwritten labels were affixed to each jar. Arachnophobia, Mrs. Gable. Claustrophobia, J. Mendez. Agoraphobia, D. Miller. There it was, the insane, terrible proof. These weren't just objects, they were the stolen fears bottled like macabre wines. A sound made him freeze. Slow footsteps overhead. Thorn. Liam instinctively retreated into the deeper shadows of the basement behind a pile of rolled-up tapestries. He heard the door at the top of the stairs open. The light increased slightly. Thorn descended a few steps, stopping halfway. He held one of the jars, one that glowed with a turbulent violet light. Liam watched him bring the jar to his lips, not to drink, but to inhale deeply, as if savoring a rare perfume. A sigh of satisfaction escaped Thorn's lips, an intimate and horrifying sound. His eyes briefly glowed with the violet light before. He turned and went back up the stairs, closing the door behind him. Liam waited, his body rigid, until he was sure he was alone again. The smell of fear, literal and figurative, seemed to cling to his clothes, his skin. He ran up the stairs, slipped out through the window he'd left ajar, and didn't stop running until he was several blocks away, panting under the dim light of a street lamp. Reality hit him with full force. There was no more room for skepticism, for rational explanations. Elias Thorn was a monster who collected nightmares, and he, Liam Kelly, had just broken into his lair and witnessed his unholy repast. The game had changed. It wasn't about a story anymore, it was about survival. Escaping Thorn's shop brought no relief, only a new layer of icy terror. Liam constantly felt the antiquarian's eyes on him, even when locked inside his apartment. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner of his eye, every car that passed too slowly on the street became a potential threat. Sleep was an intermittent luxury, haunted by images of the glowing jars and Thorn's cold smile. He knew with visceral certainty that Thorn was aware of the intrusion. The antiquarian's silence was more frightening than any direct confrontation. It was the calm of the predator who knows its prey has nowhere to run. The torment began insidiously. The vertigo he felt near high windows intensified, transforming into panic attacks that left him clinging to furniture, cold sweat dripping down his forehead. At work, the elevator became a torture chamber. More than once he had to rush out, gasping before the doors fully closed, earning strange looks from colleagues. Small objects started appearing in unexpected places. A crow's feather on his keyboard, a tiny metal globe in his mailbox, subtle reminders of his fears and his indiscretion. He received silent phone calls at odd hours, just the sound of calm, controlled breathing on the other end before the final click. Thorn's campaign extended to discrediting him. A strange email, seemingly sent from Liam's account, landed in his editor's inbox containing disjointed ramblings about soul thieves and bottled essences. The editor called him in for a serious talk about stress and the need to take leave. Liam tried to explain, to talk about Thorn, but his words sounded desperate and paranoid even to his own ears. In public, strange things happened. One afternoon, while having lunch at a cafe, he had the sudden, overwhelming sensation that the walls were closing in, causing him to knock over the table and flee into the street, to the shocked stares of other customers. He was becoming the crazy man Thorn wanted him to be. Paranoia became his constant companion. He saw Thorn's face in strangers in the crowd, heard his soft voice in the whispers of the wind. He began to doubt his own perceptions. Did that bird keychain really appear, or did he imagine it? Was the email truly planted, or did he write it in a stress-induced lapse of memory? The line between actual persecution and the erosion of his own mind was becoming dangerously thin. Thorn didn't need to attack him physically. He was dismantling Liam piece by piece, using his deepest fears and isolation as weapons. Liam felt trapped, a rat in a maze designed by a sadistic architect. Sanity was a taut thread, about to snap, and he knew he had to find a way out. A weapon, anything, before he lost himself completely in the shadows Thorn conjured around him. Liam was at his breaking point. Isolated in his apartment, curtains drawn against the world and the shadows that seemed to dance in his peripheral vision, he felt like a cornered animal. The vertigo was a constant presence, paranoia, a low hum, in his ears. He barely ate, barely slept, just relived the sight of the glowing jars and the cold touch of the bird keychain. Despair was a dark tide threatening to drown him. It was in this state of near surrender that he spread all his notes, photos, and newspaper clippings across the living room floor, a last attempt to find something, anything, he might have missed. His eyes scanned the images of the shop, the lists of victims, the descriptions of the objects. Something bothered him, not what was there, but what wasn't. There were fears of all kinds, of insects, heights, enclosed spaces, reflections, crowds. But where were the more visceral fears? Fear of death? Fear of excruciating physical pain? Fear of losing a loved one? They seemed absent, as if Thorn only collected specific, almost stylized phobias. And then he remembered something he'd seen in the shop but dismissed at the time. Among the sinister artifacts there was a small, discreet pedestal, displaying not a frightening artifact but a simple, smooth stone, almost common, with a single symbol carved into it. A circle with a dot in the center, a symbol he vaguely associated with ancient representations of the sun or life force. Thorn didn't offer it for sale. It seemed almost a personal object, treated with quiet reverence. A frantic online search for the symbol and for legends about emotion-feeding entities led him to an obscure academic paper on forgotten folklore. It spoke of shadow creatures that consumed specific terrors but were repelled or weakened by manifestations of inner light, selfless courage, sacrifice, or the simple, stubborn will to protect others, even at one's own expense. The stone symbol was mentioned as an ancient protective glyph, representing the unquenchable spark of resilience. A desperate idea began to form. Thorn fed on paralyzing fear, on selfish terror for one's own skin. But what if he were confronted not with more fear, but with its opposite? Not with aggression, but with a determination focused on something beyond self-preservation? Liam had no conventional weapons, no physical strength to fight whatever Thorn was. But maybe he had something else. The will to stop this, not just for himself, but for the catatonic victims. For David Miller staring at the ceiling. For the student who couldn't bear her own face. It was a slim chance, an insane plan born of desperation, but it was the only thing he had left. A fragmento. Liam didn't wait for the cover of night this time. With the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the historic district, he walked with steady, deliberate steps to the door of Curiosities Chills. He pushed it open without hesitation. The bell chimed, an almost comical counterpoint to the tension vibrating in the air. Elias Thorn was behind the polished counter, organizing small ivory boxes, and looked up with his clear eyes, an expression of restrained amusement on his face, as if he had been expecting him. "Mr. Kelly, what an unexpected visit. Have you come to return the little ornithological gift?" Thorn asked, a thin smile playing on his lips. "I came to end this, Thorn," Liam said, his voice steadier than he expected. He held Thorn's gaze, remembering the symbol on the stone, the idea of inner light. "Not for me, for the others. For the ones you left empty." Thorn's smile faltered for an instant, replaced by a calculated coldness. "Touching my collection was a grave mistake, Mr. Kelly. E agora a insolência de retornar." He moved away from the counter, his movements fluid and predatory. "You think you understand fear? You've seen nothing." With a swift, almost casual gesture, he swept his arm across a nearby shelf, knocking half a dozen glass jars to the floor. They shattered with a sharp crack, releasing their colorful mists, which expanded and mingled in the air like toxic smoke. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The space of the shop seemed to distort. Shadows in the corners deepened, writhing into vaguely arachnid shapes that scurried across the floor and up the walls. The ceiling seemed to lower oppressively, the walls undulating as if breathing, inducing a nauseating claustrophobia. Simultaneously, the windows appeared to recede to an infinite distance, the world outside becoming a vertiginous blur, triggering the latent agoraphobia. Whispers and muffled screams filled the air, echoes of the stolen terrors. Liam felt his own vertigo attack him with full force, the floor tilting beneath his feet, threatening to swallow him. Icy panic rose in his throat. This was exactly what Thorn wanted, to paralyze him with fear, to savor his terror before the final harvest. But then Liam closed his eyes for an instant, forcing himself to see not the hallucinations, but the faces. David Miller, staring into nothingness. The student terrified of her own reflection. The broker huddled in his apartment. The injustice of it, Thorn's calculated cruelty, ignited a spark of righteous anger within him, a hot, clean emotion that pushed the coldness of fear back. He opened his eyes, no longer focused on his own survival, but on the need to stop this horror. "You feed on their fear," Liam shouted, his voice echoing strangely in the psychic cacophony. "But you won't have mine." He advanced, stumbling against the vertigo, ignoring the shadows brushing against his legs. His gaze fixed on the pedestal where he'd seen the smooth stone with the sun symbol. That was it, the heart of the shop, perhaps Thorn's anchor. Thorn laughed, a dry, joyless sound, and gestured, intensifying the sensory assault. But something was different. Liam's determination, his refusal to yield to personal panic, seemed to cause a dissonance in Thorn's power. The manifestations flickered slightly like an out-of-focus image. The collector looked surprised, perhaps even uncomfortable. In that moment of hesitation, Liam acted. He didn't try to attack Thorn directly, but ran towards the pedestal. Thorn moved to intercept him, his fingers elongating like shadowy claws. But Liam threw himself forward, knocking the pedestal over. The smooth stone with the symbol rolled across the floor. As Thorn's hand was about to grab Liam, he ducked and touched the stone. There was no explosion of light, no visible arcane power. But as he touched the symbol, focusing all his will, not on attacking but on protecting, on denying the fear Thorn craved, a wave of silent revulsion emanated from him. Thorn screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman sound, recoiling as if burned. His body began to flicker violently, the elegant form dissolving into dark smoke. The remaining jars on the shelves started to crack, the light within them flashing erratically. With a final howl of frustration and pain, Thorn's form imploded, sucked into the multiple vortices of light from the broken jars, which then abruptly went dark. Silence fell upon the shop, heavy and sudden, broken only by the sound of Liam's ragged breathing and the tinkling of the last glass shards falling to the floor. The silence that settled over the shop was deeper than the mere absence of sound. It was a vacuum, a stillness that pressed against the eardrums. The shadows retreated to the corners, becoming just shadows again. The air, previously charged with the electricity of fear, seemed to thin, almost difficult to breathe. Liam remained kneeling for a moment, his hand still on the smooth, now cold stone, his body trembling with exhaustion and residual adrenaline. He looked around. Multicolored glass shards covered the floor like broken jewels, but the luminous mists had vanished completely. Elias Thorn was gone, undone, consumed by his own macabre collection. Slowly, Liam stood up, his legs unsteady. The vertigo was gone. The claustrophobic feeling had dissipated. He looked at the still intact shelves, at the jars that hadn't broken. They were now opaque, lifeless, like ordinary dusty glass containers. The power that had animated them, and Thorn, had been extinguished. Exhausted, he walked out of the shop, leaving the door open behind him, and blinked against the harsh late afternoon light. The world outside continued its normal rhythm, oblivious to the horror that had just been undone a few feet away. In the following weeks, the story of the antique shop became a curious footnote in the local papers. The owner disappeared without a trace. The establishment found ransacked and abandoned. Some speculated about debts, others about fleeing. Liam never told the full truth. Who would believe him? He just watched silently. There were cautious reports of improvement in some of the panic attack victims. David Miller began leaving his room, though he still seemed lost. The student, afraid of mirrors, started tolerating reflections, but her former vibrancy seemed diminished. It was as if the fear had been removed but left an invisible scar, a paleness in the soul. Liam was changed too. The vertigo that had haunted him, intensified by Thorn, vanished completely. He could look out high windows, ride crowded elevators, without the slightest pang of panic. He had faced his deepest fear and won. But the victory brought an unexpected and disturbing consequence. The absence of fear, of that tension which had in a way defined and driven him, left a strange void. It felt like trying to sense a phantom limb. He was free, but he felt hollow. Standing in front of the building where Curiosities and Chills once stood, now boarded up, he felt no triumph, no relief. Just a disconcerting silence within himself, the stillness of a space previously occupied by something terrible yet familiar. He had survived, but at a cost he was only now beginning to understand.